It is my pleasure to introduce Jordan Fisher-Smith for today's A.P.E.X. Talk. Jordan spent 21 years as a ranger for the Park Service, California State Parks, and the Forest Service in California, Wyoming, Idaho, and Alaska. His first book, Nature Noir, was a Wall Street Journal summer reading selection, a San Francisco Chronicle Best Books of 2005 pick, and an Audubon Editor's Choice. Newsweek said of Jordan in Nature Noir, quote, "He writes about the natural world with more grace than anyone since Edward Abbey." Jordan's second book, Engineering Eden, won a California Book Award and was longlisted for the Penn E.O. Wilson Award for Literary Science Writing. Jordan has also written for the New Yorker, Men's Journal, Aeon, Discover, and other outlets, and worked on 3 documentary films, one of which, Under Our Skin, was shortlisted for a 2010 Oscar for Best Documentary Feature. Jordan writes, speaks, and teaches writing from his base at Nevada City in the Sierra Nevada. I've had the great opportunity to spend some time with Jordan in the class and also in the field over the last couple days. He's a wonderful storyteller, and we are so excited to have him here at SUU. Please welcome Jordan Fisher-Smith.
Well, I've done somewhere over 120 of these since the first book. And, I've lectured in universities all over the country, and I don't think I've ever been part of a program more professional and better organized than this A.P.E.X. series. And programs like the A.P.E.X. series, if they're properly funded and run, bring the world to your university. You see more or less a bouquet of viewpoints and reports from the outside world. It's a really great academic program. I want to really give some praise and thanks to Lynn Vartan, who worked for months to plan our time together. I really want to thank Kelly Goonan, who was the one, I think, who brought up the idea of bringing me here to Lynn. And Jennifer Sorensen, who I think has been teaching the book now in the field of nature writing or environmental writing since it came out in hardcover. Thanks to Sam Wells for inviting me to talk to his class. And did Linda make it, by the way? I beg your pardon? Hey! Yeah, thank you so much. And I am especially thrilled to have with us Linda Mesu, who's the superintendent of Bryce Canyon National Park, who works very closely with SUU in its role as University of the Parks, and employs interns, many of them Kelly Goonan's interns, every year. And so thanks so much for making the Herculean effort to get here. I know I was not expecting you, so thank you. I'm also really grateful for the support of the Eccles Visiting Scholar Program. Thanks to them for making this all possible. I think what I'll do is I'll say a few things about Engineering Eden, and then I'll read to you from the book. Then Lynn Vartan and I will have a dialogue, and you can kind of join us as you feel something coming to you that needs to be talked about or asked. And then after that, the campus bookstore has arranged to be here and sell some copies of the excellent new paperback. And those of you who brought a copy with you, can line up in the same line and get yours signed. So Engineering Eden is nonfiction. Nonfiction is a remarkably broad category, probably much broader than fiction. It includes self-help books, journalism, biography, technical writing, textbooks, and way over at my end of it, something called narrative nonfiction, which is also known as creative nonfiction. I don't prefer the word the term creative nonfiction because it sort of suggests that we get to be creative with the facts, and I don't practice it that way. So what narrative nonfiction is this way of telling true stories using some of the storytelling tools of fiction: scene, dialogue, character, plot. But unlike fiction, you have to, if you practice it my way, you should do it without inventing anything. In my estimation, as much as it's possible, it should all be true. Otherwise, the writer should be honest with you and say, hey, this is fiction. So as you might imagine, this requires very dogged and intensive research in order to assemble the scene in each scene in the book. So, what did the place where this thing happened look like at the time it happened? Who's there? Who's present at the time? What are they wearing? What did they say exactly? But in the end, narrative nonfiction isn't just a bunch of facts. Even a good textbook isn't just a bunch of facts. It's got to be some kind of story. And if you can pull it off, you, the reader, will see characters. In my case, in this book, many of them are now dead, and they will be restored to life, as real as you can imagine, moving and talking on the stage of your imagination, which is a really wonderful place. The teacher of writing, John Gardner, said that what a reader wants is to be immersed in and I quote, a vivid and continuous dream. My friend, the great Western writer and late teacher of writing, Oakley Hall, said that in fiction, characters should be revealed not by a bunch of adjectives, he was really brave or she was really conscientious, but by what they actually do and say in the scene. So it's action and dialogue that make the story work, what people do and say. This is true for narrative nonfiction as much as it's true for fiction. And as I said before, I don't give myself the right to make things up. It has to be true. So this book, in its current form, happened when I started to write a book about this whole question of how much you can get away with manipulating nature, how much you should respect nature's autonomy and leave it alone, that balance that we have to strike, in the knowledge of some of the ideas that people are coming up with right now about engineering the atmosphere and so on. And I was doing background research in the excellent National Archives at Yellowstone National Park. And I was working, actually, I was using some of the magazines to get myself around to do research for the book, so I had spun off a part of the book's research as a magazine article for a science magazine called Discover. And I was working on that, and I stumbled on something I wasn't really looking for, which was a box of battered cardboard box of trial transcripts in these sort of long manila folders with the metal things that you bend at the top and the little sliders. And I began leafing through them, and as you know, their legal papers are legal size, and they have, each line is numbered. And these turned out to be transcripts from a trial at the federal district, or the United States District Court at Los Angeles, something about a lawsuit about the death of a young man named Harry Eugene Walker, who died right in the middle of the festivities celebrating the 100th anniversary of Yellowstone National Park, and he died by being attacked by a bear. There was something about that to begin with that interested me. 100 years is an approximation of a long time, long enough for things to get seriously screwed up. And the centennial was a celebration of success, and in the middle of this success, there seemed to have been some kind of failure. So, and then I began leafing through these pages, and I saw the names of two of the greatest wildlife biologists of the 20th century, and they were testifying against each other. So there's drama there. And so I set out, and I kind of fell into the idea of making this a courtroom drama. I love courtroom dramas. Like To Kill a Mockingbird, Inherit the Wind, 12 Angry Men. I think that one of the reasons I like the courtroom drama as a form is that it's really, what's really at the heart of it is the idea of finding a collective truth. And we're living through a time right now when society is very divisive, and it's gotten so much so that everybody has a different truth, meaning the facts of what happened and when no longer matter anymore. So the idea of a court is a sense of hashing out what the truth is, who did what, who's responsible, in a community. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "The law is the witness and external deposit of our moral life. Its history is the history of our moral development." Just so, it seemed to me that, and has for some time, that the national parks are a sort of external deposit as an artifact and a history of our way of dealing with nature and what we thought nature was. And the oldest parks, you go for a walk or a ride with a really great biologist in some of the oldest parks, and they can show you the layers of artifact, of human action, based on what we thought nature was and how it worked at that time. So in 1972, the National Park Service celebrated its 100th anniversary of the world's first and oldest national park, Yellowstone. It was the park's anniversary, not the Park Service's. So Yellowstone maintenance spruced up the buildings with a lot of fresh brown paint. A commemorative medal was struck and was for sale at the visitor centers, all kinds of other, probably coffee cups and postcards with the 100th anniversary on them. There was to be a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new modern visitor center at Old Faithful, and park administrators and conservationists from 84 nations had been invited to a world conference on national parks that would be opened by a keynote speech from Pat Nixon, the First Lady, who would land Marine One, the helicopter, in the parking lot at Old Faithful, get out and review a line of armed rangers on horseback. It was an impressive thing. But behind the scenes at that time, there were really troubling signs that the ecology of Yellowstone and the other early parks was dangerously muddled. Yellowstone had become the world's first national park in 1872. In 1872, human beings, civilization, were demonstrating brilliance in just every field I can think of other than the conservation of nature. By this time, they'd laid a telegraph cable across the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean between Ireland and Nova Scotia, spooled out from the stern of a 700-foot-long iron steamship. Today's guided missile cruisers are in the range of 680 feet. This essentially created an internet connecting the stock markets of London and New York at the speed of electrons. This is a very advanced civilization. But as far as nature conservation was concerned, no one had just about saved anything, really. It just hadn't been our main agenda. They had not the slightest idea how to operate a national park. The science of ecology it would take to understand nature in national parks didn't exist as a distinct field until the 1890s. And then this 1890s, by the way, is about the time of the development of atomic physics. So it's sort of a laggard science that comes in at very late in history. And even then, once it existed, for many years, for decades, it didn't have much of an impact on park operations. So to begin with, you had this 2 million acre public park, but no National Park Service. There was no one to mind the place. Yellowstone's first superintendent served for 5 years, during which he was physically present in the park only 3 times. There were no game protection laws and no one to enforce them. And so market hunters slaughtered thousands of Yellowstone animals for profit during that time. Finally, in 1886, the Army cavalry were sent in to protect the park, and they became the first organized federal firefighters. Responding on horseback to put out lightning fires, they initiated the process of total fire suppression that would lead to the thickety, fuel-loaded forests of today. They grew hay to feed back the elk herds that had been decimated by poaching. The elk population rebounded, but bison didn't. By 1901, only 25 of them were left in the park. So about from 1907 on, they were ranched like cattle to restore their numbers. In 1916, Congress created the National Park Service, and as rangers took over from the Army, they were drafted into a national program to exterminate predators like wolves and coyotes and cougars. In 1918 alone, they killed 36 Yellowstone wolves and 23 mountain lions in the park. So fed through the winter and freed from predation, elk numbers expanded out of control, and they ate everything that they could, chewing the bark off aspen trees and destroying plants that other animals relied on for food and shelter. In response, from about 1911 onward, the rangers were trapping elk and giving them away, shipping them by rail to restore depleted populations elsewhere in the country by giving them to essentially to state fish and wildlife agencies. By about 1967, they'd given away 13,000 of them, but it didn't really help. So it didn't stop the damage, and in 1934, the rangers began solving the elk problem the way they'd solved the predator problem, which was to round up elk and shoot them by the thousands. Meanwhile, private concessioners were licensed to build major resort hotels, and all the food waste and garbage that these operations generated was dumped into open-pit landfills. So bears began coming out of the woods to feed in them, and then visitors, knowing that this was a spectacle, began walking over to the dumps and watching the bears. It didn't take long for the feeding of the bears to become an organized entertainment. Outdoor amphitheaters were constructed around a low sort of stage or platform on which the garbage cans were dumped with kitchen scraps and so on, and the bears ate them and the visitors watched them, and somebody would sometimes give a lecture while that was going on. As the bears were rewarded for losing their natural fear of human beings, they began tearing up camps, breaking into buildings and cars to get food, and clawing and biting people who were feeding them by hand. In 1932, there were at least 451 reported incidents of this kind. In 1967, with all this history of manipulating things and doing the wrong thing, in 1967, a new park superintendent and a new chief park scientist responded to all the unnaturalness of everything that had been happening before by declaring a retreat from manipulating anything. The park would be left to the balance of nature. And this is really kind of where the heart of the book is. I mean, is there a balance of nature? Does nature naturally right itself if we push it off kilter, or do we need to come in and do purposeful manipulation and restoration to get it back? To cite a current example of how that's playing out in the present world, not in the hands of the Park Service, but in the larger world, if you put a lot of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, Does nature have a tendency to push back and go back naturally toward a cooler climate? Or, as seems to be happening, does the warming of the world release a lot of methane from permafrost that's melting in the northern and far southern hemisphere? And does that then push the process even faster? How does the feedback system work? Remarkably, the new superintendent, a guy named Jack Anderson, and the new chief scientist, Glenn Cole, believed fervently in the balance of nature, to the extent that they postulated that even without predators, the elk would somehow regulate themselves, I think through basically starvation, notwithstanding the great damage they were causing to the park in the process. Meanwhile, the other big animal headache, bears, would, in this new program, would be cured of their taste for human food by a very rapid closure of dumps, by pushing earth over these dumps and fencing new temporary dumps so the bears couldn't get to the garbage. Now, there were two brilliant biologists, the Craighead brothers, who were studying grizzlies in Yellowstone at that time and had invented the radio collar in order to do so. They warned the Park Service that they'd better slow the process down and they'd better maybe even bait areas in the backcountry using elk carcasses to get the bears away from populated areas, because they predicted if they just pushed earth over the dumps, the bears would come charging into populated areas looking for food that was then still available. They hadn't finished installing garbage cans that were bear-proof, and there was, restaurants with kitchen straps in the back and things like that. So I'm going to read now from Engineering Eden, and I was so happy when I began researching this story that there was just a really great ranger in it. I think I would have been very disappointed if the main ranger character hadn't been a great Park Service ranger, and he really was. His name was Jim Brady, and at that time he was a young supervisory ranger. So you'll meet him, and he later in the book will be the chief investigator of Harry Walker's death. And let's see, you'll meet in the beginning with Brady, you'll see him working on this trapping and shipping away of elk. They've stopped shooting them under pressure from a Wyoming senator by the name of Gail McGee, and Brady is working on this final trapping. I'm trying to think if I have anybody else that I should tell you about. I think that's it. In Yellowstone, in the spring of 1970, a newly promoted 30-year-old sub-district ranger was sent down from Mammoth Hot Springs to take over day-to-day operations at Old Faithful. Jim Brady was not a big man, but he had played college football, and he exuded physical confidence. His manner was thoughtful, polite, and deferential. He had a way of making people feel as if they had his total attention when they talked with him. And among his subordinates, he had a reputation for being preternaturally cool during emergencies. Brady had grown up in San Bernardino, where the smog drifting east from Los Angeles met the dust and tumbleweeds of the Mojave Desert. His father was a brakeman for the Santa Fe Railroad there, and when Brady was 14, his old man was hit by a train and put out of work. As the family slipped into poverty, Brady discovered football, which earned him an athletic scholarship to Humboldt State University in the coastal rainforests of Northern California. In addition to lumber mills and muddy scrimmages, Humboldt was known for turning out foresters and wildlife biologists. Brady majored in biology and zoology and married his high school sweetheart. By the time he graduated in 1962, he was working as a seasonal park ranger and very much wanted to be a permanent one. That summer, his wife gave birth to their first child at Yellowstone National Park. By the way, I guess I should have said, I can't really see you, so if there are any small children in the room, there is a description, very brief description of a rather horrible death in this passage I'm reading. And if that would upset you in your particular way, you can leave the room and be forewarned. It's not very long. Brady's specialty within the Park Service, as opposed to a scientist such as Glenn Cole, or a ranger naturalist like Lloyd Parrott, whose job was to give out information to visitors and teach people about nature, was to make sure that the coming and going of millions of visitors went smoothly, and to see to it that they all went home in one piece. In the early 1960s, when Brady came on the scene, the Park Service was diversifying its traditional fare of awe-inspiring scenery with new parks where the emphasis was on pure outdoor recreation. Brady got one of his first permanent jobs in 1963 at one of these, Lake Mead, the reservoir formed by the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River just outside of Las Vegas. Lake Mead National Recreation Area was a 24-hour bacchanal of alcohol, high-powered boats, firearms, and assorted other weapons. It was basically a gladiator school for young law enforcement rangers. By the time he transferred back to Yellowstone in November of 1967, Brady had been shot at 3 times. I actually looked up the reports on that, and he actually was shot at 3 times in a very short time at Lake Mead. About the first thing they found for him to do when he got back to Yellowstone was to fly around the Lamar Valley as an observer in a helicopter, chasing elk through the snow into winged fences and corrals that by then were referred to not so affectionately as McGee traps. After the beating the Park Service had taken in Senator McGee's hearings that March, they weren't shooting any elk, and as Glenn Cole implemented natural control, that was the name for this program of letting things go. As Glenn Cole instituted the program of natural control, it was the last time they would give elk away, 984 of them that winter. From the helicopter, beneath a ceiling of snow clouds, the Lamar Valley was a study in blue, gray, and black, and orange, where a shaft of low sun stole under the weather to light a distant peak. It had been snowing, and the icy wind had blown the powder off the ridges and into the gullies and low spots, where it settled in hundreds of parallel paths generations of elk had carved into the mountainsides in their desperate search for sustenance. The elk trails stood out as white lines across the stony slopes, like the contours of a topographic map. The helicopter shook as the pilot swooped back and forth, herding strings of elk through the deep snow into the gullies. After the mayhem at Las Vegas, for Brady, this was like coming home, and from the tiny bubble-canopied craft, the immensity of the valley and the white elk paths stood out beautiful, and it all looked convincingly like wilderness. Brady made a good account of himself in 1968 and 1969 in the North District at Mammoth Hot Springs, and in 1970 he was made the Old Faithful Subdistrict Ranger. Old Faithful Village is located along the Grand Loop Road in the valley of the Firehole River in the western part of Yellowstone. The meadows surrounding it are bounded on the east by the timbered ridge of Observation Point and on the west by the dark lava bluffs at the eastern edge of the Madison Plateau. In those days, the village contained some 400 buildings, the greater number of them tiny brown-painted guest cabins and other small structures. The ruling presences were 2 large historic hotels on the north end, facing a semicircular plank causeway around an aperture from which at intervals of just over an hour, the Old Faithful Geyser erupted over 100 feet in the air. Beyond the geyser, paths and boardwalks extended north into the Upper Geyser Basin and up the rounded white slope of Geyser Hill. The hill and the valley in the distance were dotted with clouds of rising steam from geysers and hot pools. The Grand Loop Road had been constructed by Army engineers in the early days as a dirt wagon track. By 1970, It was a 142-mile strip of asphalt, 22 feet wide, connecting Old Faithful to the other clusters of hotels and cabins, stores, cafes, visitor centers, marinas, and campgrounds in the park. These features constituted less than 5% of Yellowstone's total area, but absorbed over 95% of the ranger's energy. A project to divert the road around Old Faithful Village was completed for the centennial summer of 1972. But when Jim Brady took over in 1970, on an average summer day, between 11 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, from 600 to 800 cars, trucks, buses, and motorhomes rolled right through Old Faithful Village. At intervals of about 65 minutes, when the geyser went off, drivers of passing cars would stop in the middle of the road, everyone would pile out with their cameras, and the Grand Loop Road would become gridlocked in both directions. There was no getting a patrol car or an ambulance through, and as one of his first administrative actions, Brady put in a request for a motorcycle. Vehicle fires, forest fires, lost children and pets, fistfights over a parking place or some other imagined slight, spousal disputes, thefts, and the delivery of an emergency message to call home about the death of an aunt were all part of the job. Brady's life was a strange juxtaposition of quiet, sage-scented moments watching elk and bison grazing slowly across meadows, and other moments that embodied the whole intense pageant of human existence, from birth to sudden death. In June of 1970, he found himself stepping gingerly toward the edge of a pool of boiling hot water in the upper geyser basin with a rope tied around his waist, held by another ranger, and carrying a bucket of strong soap. A 9-year-old boy, walking through the geysers with his family, had stumbled off the boardwalk and fallen into the pool. His mother and father heard the splash and turned round to see him surface with a shocked expression, then sink and die. He was boiled until the meat fell off his bones. It had been known since the turn of the century, when it was done for the entertainment of tourists, that soaping the hot springs caused them to bubble more violently. This action caused what was left of the boy to rise to the surface, where Brady and his rangers skimmed about 8 pounds of the remains for burial. With all of that, the second stage of Anderson and Cole's closure plan made things twice as bad at Old Faithful that year. The bears, displaced by food reductions at Trout Creek Dump, awoke that spring to find workers bulldozing earth over Rabbit Creek Dump and installing an electrified fence around a temporary landfill at Nez Perce Creek, a couple of miles north. There were no power lines there, so a generator ran 24 hours a day, and a maintenance worker was assigned to monitor it. Alone out there at night, he saw large grizzlies getting sparked off the fence, and as Brady understood it, was so unnerved by the experience that he refused to go back. Meanwhile, in a cooperative effort with the state of Montana to keep grizzlies off garbage along Yellowstone's boundaries, the town dump at West Yellowstone was closed that summer. However, as the Walker's lawyer Steven Zetterberg forced scientist Starker Leopold to admit during his cross-examination, bears did not respond by suddenly switching to an all-natural diet. June of 1970 was exactly 2 months long, Brady remembered. Brady and his rangers spent their days dealing with people and their nights dealing with grizzlies. Scattered in the pines on the south side of the village was the housing for Park Service and concessions employees. At night, grizzlies wandered the unlit gravel roads there, past the dormitories, houses, and trailers, looking for something to eat. So Brady and his rangers were setting culvert traps, tranquilizing the bears, and relocating them. Toward the 4th of July weekend in 1970, a trap was set right in front of Brady's trailer. One night, he was awakened by the sound of a steel gate clanging shut. Luckily, his wife and 3 little girls were up at Mammoth at the time. It was about 2 in the morning. He got up and looked out the front window to where the porch light cast a pool of light around the trap. Sure enough, it was sprung. Grizzlies mate between May and July, and Brady knew that around that time, if you trapped a female, there might be a male nearby. He got on the phone and woke up Mike Warren, a bear management ranger, and asked him to get in his patrol car and drive around in the housing area to see if there were any other grizzlies around. Warren drove around, spotlighting the woods, for about 15 minutes, then radioed an all clear and pulled up in front of Brady's trailer. Brady came out to meet him, leaving the trailer door ajar as the screen door sprung shut. The two of them peered into the trap and saw a sow that they'd handled before. Suddenly Warren said, "Run!" Both men sprinted for the safety of the trailer, dove underneath the porch railing, and tumbled right through the closed screen door, demolishing it. Brady slammed the trailer door behind them as a big male bear attacked the porch in frustration and then went over to the trap with the female inside and started banging on it with his paws. Brady got out a dart pistol, sat down at the kitchen table, and loaded a dart with enough Secostrin to put down a big bear or instantly kill a human being. His hands were shaking with the adrenaline. As he finished loading the pistol, he accidentally discharged it. The dart narrowly missed Warren and lodged in the ceiling. Brady loaded another, walked over to the door, cracked it open, and darted the big male on the first shot. The bear ran off into the darkness. Brady and Warren got in Warren's car and drove around the housing area looking for the bear. Time went by, long enough for the animal to have been immobilized and then come to again. Finally, they saw a light on in a small travel trailer and heard a woman screaming. The bear was up against the side of the trailer, trying to turn it over. Brady darted the bear again. This time it went down. The two rangers went back to anesthetize the trapped female bear and towed the trap containing her over to the second bear. They woke up a couple of other rangers and tried to drag the big male into the trap, but it was too heavy. So they went and got a pickup with an electric winch, snaked the cable through the trap just past the sow, winched the male in next to her, and slammed the gate. The 6-year-old male had been transplanted twice before and was sent to a zoo. Brady isn't sure what happened to the sow. That was how it was at Old Faithful in the summer of 1970. Anderson and Cole had ordered dump closure to proceed, and Brady was determined to make it through the year without a serious bear incident at Old Faithful. He almost did. Or maybe he actually did. We may never know, because amid the daily chaos and all the good deeds of the Rangers that summer, key evidence thought to be fragmentary human remains was mishandled and lost, and although Jim Brady could not have known it, the old grizzly that would later kill Harry Walker passed through his hands. Thank you. And now,
now it's our turn. Thank you so much for reading for us, Jordan. It is so wonderful to hear your words in your voice.
And we'll find out if the mic hears my voice. Yeah, it works.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We've been having such a great week, haven't we? We have just been traveling. We've been out in the field with students. We've been sharing meals together, talking about writing, talking about the wilderness. And I have some questions for you.
Well, I'd like to hear what they are.
Okay, so one of the things that just struck me, and I should mention that we will put a mic up if we have time for questions, or if you have anything that you'd like to share, you're more than welcome. And the book signing is happening, and we will be on the radio at 3. But the first thing is, when I read Engineering Eden and Nature Noir, but especially in Engineering Eden, as you said in the beginning of the talk, I mean, it reads like a novel. Everything from in the passage that you mentioned, from the parents looking back and hearing the splash of the water. In other points, there's even the creak of someone's body, to the sound of the bear paws on the trailer. I mean, it's just such an immersive experience to read your books. And I want to peel back the onion and know how the movie is made. I want to know how you do it. How do you do this? How do you know? You weren't in these places, you weren't there. How do you make them jump off the page in the way that you do?
Well, I think thanks. That's a great question. But one of the things is that I think maybe even as a student or when in academic life, you become used to expressing ideas clearly and making arguments clearly. And this kind of writing is really relying on a lot, I think what you've said, relying on sense impressions.
Yeah.
And sense impressions come from all of our senses. What tends to come out sometimes when I teach writing, sometimes I teach some writing workshops, and what comes out at first is ideas. There's a wonderful poem by Wallace Stevens, which the title is like the whole poem. And the title is not ideas about the thing, but the thing itself. And so when I'm getting ready to write one of these scenes, I'm collecting, first of all, I'm interviewing the people. If they're still alive, I interview the people themselves who I'm writing about. If they're no longer with us, I'll interview a bunch of people who knew them. And I'll be looking at old photos of people, a lot. Engineering Eden, there must be hundreds and hundreds of photos that I took, that I used in the production. And I actually went to some of these places where scenes happen and photographed the scene. And then sometimes you've got to go back into the local archives and find out, or even a newspaper, what did it look like then as opposed to what it looks like now? Were buildings torn down? Were other buildings put up? Did the trails, change locations? And as I've hinted in this piece here that I read, did they move the whole road? Also things like smell, sound. These are things that fiction writers use all the time. And I've adopted them, but the problem is I can't make them up.
Yeah. It's absolutely not made up. I mean, it's there, and you have found all the evidence. And I think we have some special sharing of a bit of this evidence with us. We have a couple of images and things like that.
I made some copies of my notebooks as I was working on this book. And do we have those slides?
I think the first one we have is actually of Brady.
Oh, that's right. I brought
so maybe
a couple
we can put that
I brought a couple of pictures. So the guy you were just hearing about, Jim Brady, that's Jim Brady. And I don't know, do you, as I see, a kind of college football player's physical confidence in that man?
Yeah.
And, people described him as when there was a deadly emergency going on, he was absolutely cool. And this is actually Brady shortly after he finished the investigation of Harry Walker's death. In his new job, that fall, he transferred to become the Valley District Ranger at Yosemite.
So from Vegas to this wilderness and keeping that assured smile, I mean, it's those kinds of things that just jump out. And so to put the image with it really, really, really helps.
Well, and what was so interesting about this book was that a lot of the people in it look like movie stars.
Yes.
We have a picture of the Craigheads.
I think, our next shot, and I was so excited for this picture because the Craigheads are just characters.
So this is John and Frank Craighead installing one of their first radio collars on a large grizzly at Yellowstone, and this metal box, this aluminum box, is their first, bear finding direction finder. And these were such great characters to write about.
Yeah.
I think, it helps me when I love the characters.
Yeah.
And and admire them.
Yeah.
And this was so true. Even people who were fighting each other in this book, I admired, you know. And I think I have a preference, you know, Lynn, for writing about people I like or I admire.
Yeah.
Because I think we're all getting so much bad news about human beings, and that it somehow restores me to write about people who did great things, who I admire.
Well, these twins are throughout the book. They just jump off the page.
They really
and
do,
we
yeah.
can see or hear and see your affection for them. And then to see the collar complete with all the colors and the massive aluminum box, it's really fantastic. And as I understand it, you spent time in their homes, through their archives.
You know, I was very lucky in this book to have worked in 3 unaccessioned archives, 3 major ones. The first one that I worked in when I first started work on this issue of, you know, the background research, what am I going to write? How am I going to write a story? Because I write stories, right? True stories. How am I going to write a story about this business of manipulation? And Starker Leopold was right there in the beginning. I knew about Starker. He's the son of Aldo Leopold. He's a guy who's immensely powerful, probably the most powerful, influential American biologist in the resource agencies and the government during his life. And then he dies in 1983, and he utterly disappears.
Yeah.
We know all about Aldo Leopold, his father. Starker just sort of disappears.
Yeah.
And so I went looking for Starker's papers and found out there were a whole bunch of Starker's papers in a hall closet in the basement of a building at UC Berkeley that had not been accessioned.
Wow.
They were in fruit boxes, those big kind of orange boxes where the lids come off. And the guy who was the sort of emeritus department chair there was willing to let me sit in Starker's old office, which he had preserved with all of Aldo Leopold's books in it, and go through Starker's papers.
Yeah.
And then later, Frank Craighead's wife allowed me to go down in their basement and go through Frank's stuff. And then I spent days in John Craighead's basement office going through his stuff with the help of his son, Johnny.
Well, speaking of being allowed a glimpse into the world, you have very generously also shared a bit of journals of your own. And we have a couple of those drawings. So maybe we could move on to that next slide and you could tell us a little bit about this one.
I'm going to step up here so I can actually see what we're talking about. You know, the opening scene in Engineering Eden is a courtroom. I mentioned it's a courtroom drama. And in order to write that scene, I needed to know, well, what did that place look like? What was the feel of it? And it's a very grand, it's in the federal courthouse, WPA built federal courthouse on Spring Street in Los Angeles. And the first disappointment was there weren't any photographs that I could find of the courtroom just at that time, with all the furniture as it was at that time. So I thought, well, I'll just go down there and look at it. So I got on a plane. I drove out of the Sierra, I got in a plane in Sacramento and flew down to LA. I went to the courthouse and they said, well, the courtroom that this happened in is locked. There's no judge present to let you in, and we won't let people in. And so I went to the top floor of the building and went to the building manager and told him I was a retired law enforcement ranger and I really am not a terrorist. Is there any chance I could go in there just for a few minutes? And he said, well, I'll supervise you. And you cannot take a cell phone picture. I'm going to take your cell phone.
Wow.
They were really worried about terrorism at that time. They didn't want people to be able to see how the room was laid out. And so I went in the room, and this guy was sitting there tapping his foot. He had other things to do. And this was a very quick sketch of the room. So here you have the plaintiff's table, the defense table, as you're familiar with from movies and so on. The jury box is over here. There's a doorway to the judge's chamber, that little arrow, that's where the judge's chamber door is, and so on, right? So there's the bailiff and the court clerk and so on, and these were the rows of pews here. And somewhere here I say that the door handles to get in the courtroom, they literally look like a safe. Do you know what a safe handle looks like?
Yeah.
So they look like the door was the most secure kind of door you could imagine. But it's covered with red leather quilted with upholstery tacks. Beautiful things, So that's all right there. There's somewhere when Frank Craighead comes to testify in court, there's something about that there was not a single window to the outside world. And here you have these people testifying about something that happens in nature. There's no natural light. You wouldn't know what time it was but for the clock in the back of the room with Roman numerals, which it says someplace up here, and a single place where air enters the room in these sort of Airstream modern shell-like vents at the back of the room. I think what I'm saying is that everything matters, not just what you think you came about. And you want to get as much detail as you can about the whole picture so that you can write convincingly about it.
And we have a couple more, right? Maybe we advance to the next one,
going.
some drawings. Yeah.
This is just a close-up. I think we've
we could
seen
go
enough.
on, I think.
Yeah. And then this is the next page, which is, what did the columns look like? I described these pilasters that sort of hold up the ceiling. And then there's I think there's chest-high, it says something, chest-high mahogany paneling all around the room. So this is how I work all the time. I have a notebook with me all the time, and I'm trying to remember that everything matters. The sounds matter, and not get sort of tunnel vision on what I thought I had come about. Next slide, please. So this is early in the book, there's a description of where Harry grew up and where he's working until he fatefully leaves hitchhiking to see America for his first great trip and ends up at Yellowstone in the middle of the centennial. So there's a lot of stuff about the homestead there. And somebody had taken this apparently climbed up in a tree, but it shows the lower pasture, the hay barn, what the family called the hay barn. There's a corn crib over here and so on. And this is when the place was falling apart. After Wallace, the old man, had died, Harry was dead, the farm was more or less going out of business, but at least the buildings were still there. Next, please. So I went to Alabama to get a really feel for, to describe Harry and his world in detail. And many of the outbuildings had been torn down. The main house, which I'm not going to shine this in your direction, so I don't illuminate your eyeball. But basically, the house over here had been torn down and replaced on the same site. But I had great photography of it, and there's all the outbuildings, right, that existed at that time, so that when Wallace Walker goes and wakes up Harry the same way, Harry's room is out here. And Wallace goes out to Milk Barn at 3 o'clock, 3:30 in the morning, turns on the pumps, gets things ready. And then he goes and walks back across and around the front to Harry's room, and he raps on the window. He says, "Hey, Harry." And Harry gets on his rubber boots and comes out and shuffles across the gravel driveway to the milking barn where the radio is on. And apparently Wallace Walker, his favorite song was, "Dang me, dang me, they ought to take a rope and hang me." Roger Miller, right?
Wow.
And Harry's favorite song was "Hang On, Sloopy."
Wow. And this, you kind of just handed your notebook to a family member to get this beautiful...
Thank you. This isn't me. This is Jenny Walker, the youngest daughter of Wallace and Louise Walker, and the youngest sister of Harry Walker. And she's an artist. Mm-hmm. She's a pretty accomplished artist. And so I handed the notebook to her, and she made this map.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think we just have one more.
I can't remember, do we?
Yeah, one more of the journal before we get to...
So again, as I'm doing this, as I'm sort of, trying to get a sense of the layout, somebody will say something right in the middle of me writing down something about the scene. "We were John Deere people," she says. And you take that down. Even if you think you're there doing something else, you think you're doing a map, whatever you hear, whatever you see, whatever you smell. And somewhere in here, there's the catalpa tree in front of the house. There's a brief passage about Harry going fishing and using catalpa worms from that to bait his hook. Somewhere up here, when they were doing a big harvest time thing, Harry would have his friends all come over, and his mother would fix them ground steak, biscuits, and gravy. And at lunch, all the sweaty young men, boys would come trooping into the house and wash up at the sink. And Jenny said the girls would admire them. And up here, in the middle of what somebody's saying about that, we hear what's called a spring peeper, which is a frog in Alabama, rattling, and you write that down.
Yeah.
You stop yourself from doing whatever else you were doing, and you write down the spring peeper.
Well, for us, this is just so special to see that glimpse, because when you just light up when you talk about these details that you have captured, from your own personal experience. And for us, and many classes have been using the book, and just to get that insight into it.
I think what this comes down to is that the physical world matters. And I think that came to me, Linda this is second nature for somebody like Linda. The physical world in all its details matters. And we are so much slaves to ideas and big political movements and so on. And it's easy to forget that the world is made to be seen and enjoyed and cherished. And so I feel like in some way when I'm writing, I'm continuing the work that I did as a ranger by cherishing the natural world and the human world and in all its detail, and remembering that we live in the physical body in a physical world.
Thank you for that. That's incredible. That brings me to the next thing I wanted to ask you about that is so apparent, really in the topic matter, because everything is so related. One act leads to another act, which leads to another act, and then we have a bear problem. And one act leads to another act, and the bees affect the wolves, affect all this interconnectivity of the animals and the species and everything at the parks. But there's a whole nother interconnectivity, and that is of all the people and the personalities. And when we were doing some of our prep work, I was asking you about it. And I know you've been asked before and described this challah bread, the weaving and everything of that. And I think we have one last picture that I would love to use as a way to sort of ask you about the interconnectivity of the book and the stories.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I wrote something into the book that I haven't actually said in the book that was a sort of, writers have a word conceit, which doesn't mean like a conceited person, but a kind of way of working or idea behind something. And in this case, what I decided to do was to see if it was possible to tell a story about people in a way, in a form, an artistic form, that represented the way the world actually works. And the way the world actually works is what John Muir said, which is you try to tease out anything by itself and you find out that it's hitched to everything else in the universe. But human culture, civilization, hasn't always been built on that idea. And I think in our time, I just thought it was important to try to do art in a way that represented something important about where we're at in the middle of this Anthropocene. And where we're at in the middle of the Anthropocene is whether we care or not, whether we know it or not, everything is connected. And therefore, there will be unintended consequences for everything we do. And not only that, but we've been sometimes, some of us, not here with this great school and its history, but in the past we were taught what was called the great man theory of history, which is this guy was born, this Mozart was born out of nowhere, and he was just brilliant, and he could do these things, right? Or, you get the idea, Vermeer, the painter Vermeer. If you go and, Vermeer's famous for these shafts of light going through the window and lighting some woman who's really a maid or some regular person leaning on a kitchen table. And it turns out that at the same time in Delft, in the Low Countries in Holland, there were a bunch of other people doing that same stuff. We just don't know their names. And so it's community, you know. The idea of community is an ecological term. And I wanted to write a story and see if you could form the narrative in a way that secretly said everything is connected. So there's all these people and landscapes and ideas and universities and so on, and I'm trying to tell a story as if all the connections mattered.
Yeah, and they do matter. And then when we look at this, at how you thread them together and all of the different people and all of the different personalities, it really is just amazing at how you connect those lines and how you do that. So is this your way? You put the characters and then thread them?
Well, so this is very early, when there were a bunch of things here that, that didn't end up in the book. I knew right away that Starker was right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Because Starker was just this amazing scientist who expressed something about parks and how to run them that's been too easily boiled down into a single phrase called, that's the vignettes of primitive America, for which he's been sort of, disposed of. But the rest of what he said was incredibly prescient about where we're at now. So I just began thinking about all the things I wanted to know about or was working on at the time, all the things that were in the field of the book. And remember, many of them didn't end up in the book. And to see how they were connected to each other. And so I began drawing pictures like this, a number of them, to see what the connections were between all the things that I'd been doing research on. And then gradually I sort of winnowed it down to some manageable thing. But the idea here is more the form, that this, I don't want to glorify myself by saying I work in art, but I think at some level, narrative nonfiction is art.
Yeah.
And this art is based on the idea of connectivity. There's this idea of the Zen patriarchs invented this thing called Indra's net. This is a Mahayana Buddhist idea. And it's just another way of saying what John Muir said, which is the net of connectivity that connects all things and all people. So I'm experimenting in this drawing very early, and right around the time I sold the book in proposal and didn't know what it was yet. I'm experimenting with that idea.
Well, for us, it's such a treat to see this, because we would have no way of really looking inside your world. So I thank you for that. We are already out of time, but I have so many things to continue in the conversation on the radio with you.
And we didn't get to talk to all the people.
We didn't, but you will be available. We'll be here at the front if you'd like to share any stories or have any questions. And then, of course, we'll have the book signing as well. So for the moment, we're going to sign off and say goodbye. And I'm going to say thank you so much to Jordan, but we'll keep the conversation going as the day continues.
Well, thank you, Lynn. And it's been a real pleasure being here with you.
Thank you so much. We'll see everyone soon.